Hello everyone, this is video 1 in our Introduction to Genetics Notes videos. This one is going to be about Gregor Mendel. I'm going to give you a quick overview though. Just as a reminder, genetics, remember, is the study of heredity, and heredity is the study of traits being passed from generation to generation. Heredity and inheritance, we use these words kind of interchangeably, but remember that inheritance is determined by factors that get passed from one generation to the next, and those factors are called genes. So just a little bit of vocab reminder there. So let's start with Gregor Mendel. So who is Gregor Mendel? Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk who was born in 1822. He worked in the monastery gardens and he became really fascinated with pea plants that grew there and decided to start doing some breeding experiments on them. During his breeding experiments, what he found out was that the patterns of inheritance, or that inheritance followed specific patterns, and he saw these patterns and decided that some traits were dominant over others and others were recessive. Those ones that the dominant traits were dominant over were called recessive, and that all of these inherited factors came from the parent, in this case pea plant, but would come from a parent in the same way that blonde hair or brown eyes or hitchhiker's thumb would come from a human parent. Plants would follow, specifically pea plants would follow these same patterns. So what he did was he looked at a bunch of different traits, but more specifically he looked at the shape of the pea pod, whether it was round or wrinkled, the color of the pea, whether they were yellow or green, and whether the actual plant itself was tall or short. He found with the parent generation, if he crossed a round with a wrinkled pea, he got round peas. If he crossed a yellow with a green plant, he got green plants. And if he crossed a tall with a short plant, he got tall plants. This showed him that certain traits were dominant over others, giving him the concept of dominant and recessive. He then took the breeding of the plants further, and he took that first generation called the F1 and he crossed it again to see if crossing a round with a round, a green with a green, or a tall with a tall would result in all round, all green, and all tall. He saw then that you did get some, specifically 25%, of the recessive. From all of these experiments, he came up with his 3 laws of inheritance: the law of segregation, the law of independent assortment, and the law of dominance. We kind of already talked about the law of dominance, but this is the idea that organisms have alternate forms of genes called alleles, and they express the form differently depending on what the allele is, whether the allele is dominant or recessive. An organism only needs one dominant trait to show, or one dominant allele to show the dominant trait, if we're talking about Mendelian genetics. The law of independent assortment just says that genes for different traits are sorted separately from one each other, so they don't really depend on each other. And the law of segregation tells us that each inherited trait is defined by a pair of genes. You get one gene from each of your biological parent that get passed on through the sex cells, the egg, and the sperm.